So it's been a little over 10 months since I got an espresso machine that my uncle found for me used on eBay. And I've been screwing around with it, tinkering with it ever since. I've been spending a lot of time in the Espresso subreddit learning things. So I'm here to tell you the basics of kind of what I've picked up in 10 months of working with a home espresso machine. Now, when I say things that I've learned about espresso, I am not talking about this thing. A mocha pot does not make espresso. It makes something that's espresso-ish, but this thing only gets up to around 2 bars of pressure, whereas an espresso machine is 9 bars. Another common misuse of the word espresso, I'm not talking about this thing, I'm not talking about AeroPresses. It's a very different texture, a very different set of things to solve compared to an espresso machine. So what I've learned about espresso is that it is fickle as hell. The reason these other brewing methods are in a different class compared to espresso in terms of brewing difficulty is the sensitivity to the grind size. In fact, it's recommended that you do not use the same grinder for your general coffee methods as for your espresso, because your espresso brew is so sensitive to grind size. I could put 2 piles of grounds right next to each other with slightly different grind settings on my espresso grinder, and they would look identical to you, and yet the brew times on them would be drastically different and the qualities of them would be drastically different. And that leads me to the number one lesson I have learned in my wrestling with the capricious and fickle mistress that is espresso. The grind size. The grind size is incredibly important. You cannot solve this problem without getting the proper grinder. There's no way to cheat your way around it. I tried to mod my burr grinder, which in addition to being a very frustrating process, wasn't successful anyway. The grinder that I had, the DeLonghi Dedica 521 kg, is perfectly fine for my everyday drip brew or French press or pour over, AeroPress or mocha pot or whatever. It's just not sufficient for espresso. Even though it says espresso written right on it, like these settings are for espresso, nonsense. Very wishful thinking. You need to buy a proper grinder. And as they say in the Espresso subreddit, buy once, cry once. So you just have to pony up the dough for a proper grinder. In terms of what the best espresso grinder is, there's a lot of good articles on the internet of what constitutes a good espresso grinder. You can check the reviews on the various grinders. And there's a trade-off between different factors. I like to single dose, meaning that I leave the grinder hopper completely empty. I measure out the weight of the beans I'm going to use, and then I pour that into an empty grinder. So I'm only grinding exactly what I've measured out to put in the hopper that particular time. So that's called single dosing. With single dosing, your number one emphasis is a grinder with a lower retention. So the idea is that whenever you grind with your grinder, some of the grinds get stuck behind kind of in the gears and the burrs. And different grinders have different amounts of retention. There is a trade-off in that grinders with lower retention do so because they have smaller burrs, which means that you have a little bit less precision in terms of the overall uniformity of your grind size. But I was willing to do that because I wanted to get a single doser. But if you're doing something different, then you might want larger burrs so that you can get a little bit more precision in terms of the uniformity of your grind size, even though there's a bit more retention. The issue is, the reason retention is undesirable is because you're going to be making adjustments to your grind size. And whenever you make an adjustment, then the first couple grams of what you get after making the adjustment are not going to reflect the adjustment you made, because the first couple of grams you get are always stuck inside the machine before. So lower retention is better in that you have less wasted beans, less beans to burn through before the grinds coming out of the machine are caught up to the latest setting that you did. And espresso is very sensitive to setting. So I happen to have a Baratza Seti 270. There's a more expensive version of this grinder, which is the 270 WI, which I think will grind by weight but this is superfluous. If you just buy a separate scale, which is going to be a higher quality scale anyway, and you're single dosing, you're weighing out your beans ahead of time, there's no reason that you have to weigh it as it comes out of the machine. You just grind until the hopper's empty. There's a cheaper one called the Barazza Seti, I think it's called the 21 or 27 or something like that, and that doesn't have the fine increments between it. That's not gonna do it. I don't know anybody who's used that. Maybe it's fine, but I wouldn't expect so, because what this thing has is little micro adjustments between the major step settings, and the micro adjustments are really what you need to be able to dial in your espresso that perfectly. So what you're doing is basically whenever you get a bag of beans, you have to dial in that bag. So every single bag you get, you have to figure out what the right fineness setting is on the grinds, and there's no way to tell ahead of time. You can tell a little bit based on altitude. Higher altitude beans like Ethiopian beans are going to be denser, and therefore you're going to want to go for a finer grind anyway. But overall, you just have to do trial and error. Sometimes you get it quickly, sometimes it takes half the bag, frustratingly, to get to a good grind setting. And you have to do that with every new bag of beans. There's no way of telling whether you have the right grind setting to begin with. There's really no shortcut to it. And the idea is that you're putting them into your espresso machine, and presumably you've got a recipe. I like to do a classic 2-to-1 ratio of coffee that comes out to grinds in. And you're aiming for basically a 25 to 30 second shot as a good ballpark. And I found that's a pretty good measure of what comes out to be quality. And if your shot comes out too slow, you choke the machine, you've gone too fine, or maybe you've made it too fine that the thing's actually started channeling. And if your shot comes out too fast, then basically that means your grind needs to go finer because it's getting through too easily. And so you're just kind of screwing around with the grind size of this. I mean, you can play around with the dosage a little bit, or the ratio of it, but you basically want to have the grind size down as the major thing that's going to result in you getting a satisfying shot of espresso when you're done. So that's the main thing I've learned. The grinder really does matter, and there's no getting around having a proper grinder. By the way, this is why if you're going to gift someone an espresso machine, you don't want to give them a fully automatic one that is a built-in grinder. It's a very expensive mistake of a gift to give, because the general consensus is that the onboard grinders that come with these fully automatic espresso machines are just woefully inadequate to give you anything quality. So if you're trying to give a gift, you're better off getting them a separate espresso machine and grinder so that they can actually get something out of it. The ones with the built-in grinders, like I said, you very quickly run into the limitations of that, and you're not going to get anything very satisfying. The other thing is you need a scale. You need a scale with a timer to be able to have any sense of what you're doing. Because again, what you're looking for is the time it takes to pull the shot with whatever ratio recipe you've chosen, and without a timer, you can't know at what point in time you've met that ratio. And like I said, the time is the best way to determine whether or not you are remotely in the right ballpark for the grind size, which in turn tells you whether or not you're going to get an overall satisfying flavor versus something that's sour, acidic, versus something that's over bitter and kind of burnt. So those are my lessons into the world of espresso. Get a proper grinder. So thanks for watching. Remember to stay coffee snobby.